So it's Mari McInerney here, and I'm speaking to Kaye and Megan at the Sharing Minds Forum in Melbourne. Well, Kaye, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kaye Graves, and I work with Bendigo Community Health Services and manage this project. My role is in cultural diversity and relationships.
And Megan, you just presented here. What's your role there at Bendigo Community Health?
So I'm employed as a cultural strategic worker on the Learning to Live Well program, which is funded by Tandem and BIMIAC.
Now, that was really interesting to hear about what's actually happening with the refugee population in Bendigo. You've become a destination of choice. Can you describe what's been happening there and who's coming and where they're coming from?
Yeah, no worries at all. So Bendigo has got mainly a Karin refugee population. So it's only in the last 10 years that we've began to see the refugee population migrate to Bendigo. So we've got about 2,000 now. So it started in 2007 with 3 monks and 1 family, has increased since then slowly, and we continue to welcome more refugees all the time. In the last month and a half, 2 months, we've had 80 new arrivals from the Thai-Burma border.
And can you talk about the Karen people, just a little bit about their background?
Yeah, so look, the Karen people have come from years of trauma and torture. So they've migrated to the refugee camps due to persecution from a military perspective. So
in Myanmar.
In Myanmar, in Burma, Myanmar. They have all fled to the refugee camps for political and religious and cultural reasons. And for many of them, they've spent most of their life living in the refugees camps, some up to 20 years.
Now, you talked about that there's great excitement about their arrival and that they're coming, forming a real community there, but you're now seeing the gaps in services available to them, particularly in mental health. What has your report found and looked for?
Do you want to take this one?
Look, through this project, Megan's undertaken 7 consultations with almost 100 people, using a validated tool to identify levels of distress linked to their pre-settlement experience. So even with those that we were able to access through the consultations, most of them are fairly connected with services and community and family. There was a high level of distress that was identified. So that, and with the rather rapid and intense settlement in Bendigo, it just means that our service providers, we need to build out the capacity of our service providers to keep up with the need of this new and emerging community, which we'll be working on, and we have started to do that.
And what particularly about the capacity is needed?
Well, understanding the refugee lived experience, understanding the culture and faith associated with the refugee communities, understanding the impact of the pre-settlement experience, because what we know is that through the identified pre-lived experience, the impact of torture and trauma and deprivation with food and poor living conditions and lack of opportunity, for some it interrupts their learning. Now, one of the things that fascinated us about this project at the very beginning was we know there are families that thrive and there are families, aren't there, Megan, that don't thrive. And we're trying to seek to understand what are the risk and protective factors and what can we then, as a community and a group of service providers, do to build those protective factors.
Can you give us some insights on those protective factors particularly?
Yeah, so it's the basics. So it's the acquisition of the English language, it's the use of interpreted material, it's family supports, it's job. Employment is the big one. Finding employment for our refugees and that sense of community and able to contribute. It's family, it's cultural celebration. So the benefit of Bendigo and why we're seeing a huge migration of secondary settlement, people coming from other parts of Australia, is that we have that cultural connection. So we've got religious leaders and the Karen organisation of Bendigo is very prominent in making sure that they continue to embed cultural, like the wrist tying ceremony and the water festival every year in Bendigo. We hold them as a cultural celebration. So
Just on the cultural, what we've read about and what we firmly understand being part of this project and previous years of working with this community is that there's a balance between our people of refugee background wanting to integrate but they have absolutely every right, and we encourage them to maintain their cultural identity and their language and their faith, because we know that's a real protective factor, once they've landed in a completely new city. So Bendigo has been really supportive in creating opportunities with our refugee folk, in providing opportunity for their cultural celebrations, as Megan says. We also have around 200 Afghan refugees, and we've got a new and emerging South Sudanese community. But this project is focusing just on the Karin community at the moment.
Now, Australia has settled refugee communities' populations over many decades. So is it easy to ramp up your services to meet those needs, or are there particular needs in Bendigo? Is it a different thing?
I think that, first of all, gathering evidence of need, and then, everybody, there is a great willingness in Bendigo to welcome and work with our people of refugee background.
Yeah.
But we need to gather evidence, which this project has enabled us to do, and to start to understand more about the lived experience. We could open up a service, but unless we, as Megan has said, build the capacity of our refugee community in understanding what mental health is, then they're not going to access the services. So there's quite a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of goodwill to do that work.
There's a very fine line, I think, between building health literacy of our refugee population when we don't have the service provider capacity at this stage to actually be able to service that need. So this project is very much working across both of those areas to build service provider capacity, but also build the health literacy of our refugee population as well.
So what's the next step then?
Oh, look, we're working really closely with the community, and the added bonus of this community is we've been able to engage the community leaders to become part of the reference group. So we're hoping to build their capacity to continue the project. We're really looking for more, we're just scratching the surface at this stage in Bendigo, and we really want to continue this work. So I suppose what we're really looking for is future ways to fund continuing work in this area and to build on what we've learned.
And one thing that you said was there's an emerging crisis for young people, and you said it's not something that schools are necessarily able to address. What's the issue there?
So what we're finding is that our youth in particular are really struggling with not only their lived experience, as we've talked about, so where they've come from, but the competing cultures. So that they're being, I guess, thrust into a culture, learning all of these new things about independence and autonomy, whereas previously, or within their culture, it's very family orientated. So I guess they're having that cultural tensions as well as the transgenerational conflict that they're dealing with. So we're finding that youth mental health is becoming a big issue, and we are in Bendigo still in the process of building the capacity of our youth service providers to actually deal with that, because the way that we would deal with mental health for our youth is not necessarily culturally appropriate for our Karin youth. So it's looking at ways we can build capacity to better support them.
This project really sought to understand what the risk and protective factors are, look at the pre-settlement experience, so we can gather the evidence. Going forward, we will be looking at further funding to look at that evidence and for us to all learn together about that, particularly with our youth and particularly with some of our women, so that we can build the cultural intelligence of service providers, because it's really new for Bendigo. 10 years is not a long time. We have a refugee settlement network that's rich and robust, and through that network we'll be hoping to build the cultural intelligence and the understanding of the pre-settlement experience and what the impact is on learning, and also work with our community, just as we've heard in other projects today, build the capacity of some peer educators and other people to spread the word about what is mental health. You don't have to suffer. In Australia, in Bendigo, there is no stigma attached to that. That's what we seek to do, and that the life that you've had to put up with can be different in our city. We're very keen and we feel very strongly about this.
And we want to support families as a whole, don't we? We're not going to focus the plan is not to focus solely on the youth, because there's no point in supporting the youth if the family's not on board. So
it's going to be a multifaceted approach, and it needs to be, because we know that the pillars of settlement, the keys to settlement, as Megan has said, is the acquisition of functional English. It's job. If you don't want a job, you might want to go to university. How do you get there? So it's creating the pathways and creating that awareness of mainstream providers about the needs of this population. It's looking at their health literacy, understanding that, yes, no, you don't have to put up with that in Bendigo, Australia. It's looking at, assessment and diagnosis and what that means. And it's building our workforce too to become more diverse, don't you think?
Yeah, we'd love to set some benchmarks, ideally, for service providers for cultural competence and sensitive practice.
How would you see that done?
Well, it will be working with the service providers definitely to identify, and the local community, our refugee population, to identify, key indicators, whether it's the use of translated material, whether it's the use of interpreters, and how we best do that to support our local community.
Because we've heard quite a bit about that today, about how interpreting doesn't necessarily interpret experience or mental health, yeah?
And they don't always have the words.
No, there's different words for different... So for instance, I understand for gallbladder, there isn't such a word in Karen, the Karen language. So it's not work that you can do quickly. It's got to be a long-term, multifaceted investment built from the bottom up with and for our community, and working with our service providers. And I think we've got a lot of goodwill. So we'll be taking the findings from this piece of work that Megan's been doing and using that as a really good platform to go forward.
And the challenge is not just to service providers and to the population themselves. Who's the challenge too? What resources do you need, and who do you need them from?
Obviously we'd be looking for further funding to extend the recommendations of this work that Megan's so eloquently undertaken with our community. So we'll be building the capacity of understanding the refugee settlement, of understanding the Karen culture, to understand the pre-settlement impacts on learning, so that we can create equity and access to health. It'll be also building the capacity and the health literacy in a broad sense of our community within their cultural context. So that will mean engaging, we think, a more multicultural workforce. It could be we use a peer educator model of Karen champions, but that's yet to go forward. Yeah, we don't feel pessimistic about this. We feel very optimistic because this project has enabled us to find this evidence, and we operate in a no-blame zone.
And we, in increasing engagement in our local population, it can only help their mental health.
Absolutely.
That's our plan and our hope going forward.
Look forward to hearing much more about it. Thank you both.